And we are ready. So today we are looking at Daniel chapters 4 and 5. I could have you turn there. There was a reason why we skipped over these chapters the last time we were in Daniel, and that's because they belong together. You have two instances where essentially the same thing is happening with different reactions. Now, when we begin in chapter 4, King Nebuchadnezzar, what do we know about him? Well, we know he was probably the apex of the Babylonian kings. We know that it was he who did the conquering. The rest after him just ruled over the territory he had created. And we know that he was the one who finally brought Jerusalem down, cleared out all of the temple furnishings and most of the people of the land, and was directly responsible for Daniel and his friends being where they are. So it's very unusual, and most people think highly unlikely, that you would hear him write something like this. King Nebuchadnezzar, to all peoples, nations, and languages that dwell in all the earth, peace be multiplied to you. It has seemed good to me to show the signs and wonders that the Most High God has done for me. How great are his signs, how mighty his wonders. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and his dominion endures from generation to generation. This is one of the reasons why biblical critics, people who do not believe that the Bible is actually true, say that this is probably historical fiction, because it's so unlikely that that kind of a king would make that kind of a statement publicly. Well, why would he make such a statement? We'll come back to this statement later, but this is what happens. We have three sections here. It goes from first person to third person to first person again. So we start out with I, Nebuchadnezzar, was at ease in my house and prospering in my palace. I saw a dream that made me afraid. As I lay in bed, the fancies and visions of my head alarmed me. So I made a decree that all the wise men of Babylon should be brought before me, that they might make known to me the interpretation of the dream. We've been here before. In fact, this was how we introduced Daniel. The king has had a dream that disturbs him. Now, the last time this happened, the bit about him was actually really good. It was the statue with the golden head and the silver, and as you went down, the statue's materials sort of lost value. But he was the head, the golden head, the best of the best. This is different. But the same thing happens. He calls in his magicians, his enchanters, his Chaldeans, his astrologers. This time he tells them the dream, and they could not come up with an interpretation. And it says, at last, Daniel came in before me, he who was named Belteshazzar after the name of my God, and in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And I told him the dream. So now we find out what it is. O Belteshazzar, chief of the magicians, because I know that the spirit of the holy gods is in you, and that no mystery is too difficult for you, tell me the visions of my dream that I saw and their interpretation. The visions of my head as I lay in bed were these. I saw, and behold, a tree in the midst of the earth, and its height was great. The tree grew and became strong, and its top reached to the heavens. And it was visible to the end of the whole earth. Its leaves were beautiful, and its fruit abundant, and in it was food for all. The beasts of the field found shade under it, and the birds of the heavens lived in its branches, and all flesh was fed from it. I saw in the visions of my head as I lay in bed, and behold, a watcher, a holy one, came down from heaven. He proclaimed aloud and said thus, chop down the tree, lop off its branches, strip off its leaves, and scatter its fruit. Let the beasts flee, from under it and the birds from its branches. But leave the stump. Leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, amid the tender grass of the field. Let him be wet with the dew of heaven. Let his portion be with the beasts in the grass of the earth. Let his mind be changed from a man's, and let a beast's mind be given to him. And let 7 periods of time pass over him. The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men, and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men. That's quite some dream. And so he says, all right, tell me what it means. All these guys have not been able to do that, but I know, because of the spirit that's in you, you can. So go for it. And Daniel, it says, was dismayed. His thoughts alarmed him. Well, let's see. You're standing in front of the most powerful man in the world. He is looking at you with eager anticipation that you will tell him what this dream means. And you know that it means trouble for him. And you have to tell him. I hate being the one to break news to people. I always wish it was somebody else. And I bet he did too, just then. Because here's what he has to tell him. He starts out, after the king says, yeah, don't let it alarm you, just say what it is. He says, my lord, may the dream be for those who hate you, and its interpretation for your enemies. This tree you saw, and he goes through the whole description that he was given, yes, this tree, it is you, O king, who have grown and become strong. Your greatness has grown and reaches to heaven, and your dominion to the ends of the earth. And because the king saw a watcher, a holy one, coming down from the heaven, saying, chop down the tree and destroy it, but leave the stump of its roots in the earth, bound with a band of iron and bronze, etc., etc., etc. This is the interpretation, O king. It is a decree of the Most High, which has come upon my lord the king, that you shall be driven from among men, and your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field. You shall be made to eat grass like an ox, and you will be wet with the dew of heaven. And 7 periods of time will pass over you till you know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And as it was commanded to leave the stump of the roots of the tree, your kingdom shall be confirmed for you from the time that you know that heaven rules. Therefore, O king, let my counsel be acceptable to you. Break off your sins by practicing righteousness, and your iniquities by showing mercy to the oppressed, that there may perhaps be a lengthening of your prosperity. I expect there was quite a moment of silence after this. O king, something very odd is going to happen to you. And I wonder how long any of this remained in Nebuchadnezzar's thoughts. Because it says, starting in verse 28, all this came upon the king. So all this came upon the king at the end of 12 months. So it was a year later. He was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon. And the king answered and said, which shall fall under the heading of famous last words, is not this great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence and for the glory of my majesty? And while the words were still in the king's mouth, there fell a voice from heaven. O King Nebuchadnezzar, to you it is spoken, the kingdom has departed from you, and you shall be driven from among men. Your dwelling shall be with the beasts of the field, and you shall be made to eat grass like an ox. 7 periods of time shall pass over you until you know the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. And immediately the word was fulfilled against Nebuchadnezzar. He was driven from among men, ate grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven till his hair grew as long as eagle's feathers, and his nails were like birds' claws. Yikes. And this 7 periods of time is sometimes thought to say even 7 years. That's a long, long time to live the way he is described as living. But it says at the end of the days, and we're back to I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever. For his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. All the inhabitants of the earth are accounted as nothing, and he does according to his will among the host of heaven and among the inhabitants of the earth. And none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? It says, at that same time, my reason returned to me, and for the glory of my kingdom, my majesty and splendor returned to me. My counselors and my lords sought me, and I was established in my kingdom, and still more greatness was added to me. So, haircut, change of clothes, went back to living in houses, and was actually better than he was before. And the moral of the story comes in verse 37. Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and extol and honor the King of heaven, for all his works are right and his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. Now, I want to point something out, first off. In both the beginning and the end sections in here, did you notice that at no point does he ever say that the Most High God is the only God? It's not as though this has made Nebuchadnezzar into a proselyte. What he has done, though, is recognize the power of the God of Israel, which is a remarkable thing. Because if you look, have a glance back at Isaiah chapter 36. When the king of Assyria invaded Judah and raised a siege around Jerusalem, there's a certain statement made. When they're saying, don't listen to King Hezekiah, this is what the king of Assyria says. Make your peace with me. We're looking at chapter 36, starting in verse 16. Come out to me, and each of you will eat of his own vine, of his own fig tree, and each will drink the water of his own cistern until I come and take you away to a land like your own land, a land of grain and wine, a land of bread and vineyards. Beware lest Hezekiah mislead you, saying, the Lord will deliver us. Has any of the gods of the nations delivered his land out of the hand of the king of Assyria? Where are the gods of Hamath and Arpad? Where are the gods of Sepharvaim? Have they delivered Samaria out of my hand? Who among all the gods of these lands have delivered their lands out of my hand, that the Lord should deliver Jerusalem out of my hand? There was a mindset at this time, particularly, just throughout the ancient world, that a conquered people was, their God was inferior to the God of the conqueror. And so it would have been with Nebuchadnezzar. He had gone in, desecrated the temple, stripped it of all its furnishings. So it would have been thought that Naturally, his god, and you notice he did mention his god was Bel, because Belteshazzar was named after the name of his god. So it would be thought, right, Bel must be superior to Yahweh. But what we find throughout Scripture, and particularly in the books of the prophets, is that the Lord has authority, not only over his own people, but also over all people. And chapter 4 of Daniel, it's like he's making this point very clear to the greatest of the Babylonian kings, that you may think that you've built this great Babylon by your mighty power and for your glory. But guess what? I can take all of that from you whenever I want to and give it to whomever I please. Which is something to say to someone who has conquered the entire known world. This is kind of interesting because these two chapters are paired together. You have chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, the great Babylonian king, who really does, according to human terms, have plenty of reason to think very highly of himself, his abilities, his glory, being brought low until he acknowledges the authority of the God of heaven, the God of Israel, over his life. And now you have chapter 5. Now, after Nebuchadnezzar, there was a sort of a co-regency. There was a king, Nabonidus. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing that correctly. Ancient Babylonian is not one of my studies in languages. But he had a son named Belshazzar, and they were co-regents for a time. And Belshazzar made a great feast, it says, for 1,000 of his lords, and drank wine in front of the 1,000. Now, when I was growing up and I was hearing the story in Sunday school, I never realized just how big this gathering was. I was always thinking it was like, maybe about the size of your average potluck dinner, where you had maybe 50, 60, 70 people. I looked up, and this would be about the seating capacity of which one was it? Like the Fitzgerald Theater in St. Paul. This is a lot of people. So this is a very showy occasion where Belshazzar is making a great point of how wealthy he is. Now, he has done nothing to earn this wealth. But listen to what it says about him. He made a feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. And Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father, more on that later, had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem, commanded they be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. You almost hit the end of that passage and you say, where do you start with this? Well, I'd like to start with the fact that he calls Nebuchadnezzar his father. And to my knowledge, there was actually no blood relation between them, but it's like he's saying he has inherited the majesty and the glory of Nebuchadnezzar. So Nebuchadnezzar's doings are practically his. So we take these vessels out of this temple that my father Nebuchadnezzar conquered. And remember, we're talking about a place and a time where the mindset is the conquered God is inferior to the conqueror's God. So you take these sacred vessels and you drink from them to praise the gods that you worship that have obviously triumphed over this regional God. And I dare say this was a fairly, to put it in modern terms, a fairly wild party. Because they are drinking quite a lot. And in the midst of this raucous party where they are praising idols with the quote unquote proof of the downfall of the God of Israel, a disembodied hand appears. It says, the fingers of a human hand appeared and wrote on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace opposite the lampstand. Now, probably the brightest lit place in the entire room. And here's a hand. Whose hand? They don't know. And it's writing. What does it write? They don't know. The king saw the hand as it wrote, and his color changed, and his thoughts alarmed him. His limbs gave way, and his knees knocked together, and he called loudly to bring in the enchanters. Wait, we've been here before. The enchanters, the Chaldeans, the astrologers, come in. And the king declares to the wise men of Babylon, whoever reads this writing and shows me its interpretation shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around his neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. That's a pretty good deal. If. We'll get to the if later. They come in. You can see they're probably, looking at the writing, muttering to themselves, and maybe trying some little, whatever the magic they do. And the outcome is they could not read the writing or make known to the king the interpretation. Now we're in trouble. So King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. He was just alarmed before. Now he's greatly alarmed. And his color changed, and his lords were perplexed. What do you say to the man whose wise men have just failed him and is facing this peculiar, ominous, supernatural phenomenon? Well, what do you say that won't get you executed? That's the question. Now the queen, and in here it says there is a possibility that this means the queen mother, not one of the wives of the current king, but an older woman from a previous administration. And it says, because of the words of the king and his lords, she came into the banqueting hall. Word is spreading. And she declared, O king, live forever. Let not your thoughts alarm you or your color change. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. In the days of your father, here we are again, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, made him chief of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and astrologers, because an excellent spirit, knowledge, and understanding to interpret dreams, explain riddles, and solve problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. My first question when reading this is, how come he didn't show up with the rest? Because he did in Nebuchadnezzar's day. I kind of get the feeling that when the administration changed, Daniel probably, if you want to call it losing ground, lost some of his renown. It was kind of like in those, in Exodus, where it said in those days, a Pharaoh arose that did not know Joseph. Well, we have a Babylonian king who did not know Daniel. But the counsel of the queen mother guides him, and Daniel is brought in before the king. And the king says to Daniel, "You are that Daniel, one of the exiles of Judah, whom the king my father brought from Judah." Now, this is a peculiar way to identify a person who has been in the administration for, at this point, probably a couple decades at least. He's still identified as one of the exiles of Judah, which tells us something about Daniel. It tells us that he has not yielded his identity. So the king says, "I've heard that the spirit of the gods is in you," etc., etc., etc. And all these wise men, etc., have failed me. They have been brought in before me to read this writing and make known to me its interpretation, but they could not show the interpretation of the matter. But I have heard that you can. Now, he offers him the same offer that he gave to the others. You'll be clothed with purple, have a chain of gold around your neck, be the third ruler in the kingdom. And, you would think, this is kind of the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar would have done. But Daniel's response is quite different. His first words to the king, Belshazzar, are, "Let your gifts be for yourself and give your rewards to another." "Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king and make known to him the interpretation." "O king," and this sounds very much like a tangent, but it isn't. It's just a really, really long preface. He recites to Belshazzar the history of his father, the king. "O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty. And because of the greatness that he gave him, all peoples, nations, and languages trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he killed, and whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would, he raised up, and whom he would, he humbled. But when his heart was lifted up and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was brought down from his kingly throne, and his glory was taken from him. He was driven from among the children of mankind. His glory was taken from him. His mind was made like that of a beast, and his dwelling was with the wild donkeys. He was fed grass like an ox. His body was wet with the dew of heaven until he knew that the Most High God rules the kingdom of mankind and sets over it whom he will. And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew of all this. But you have lifted up yourself against the Lord of heaven. And the vessels of his house have been brought in before you, and you and your lords, your wives, and your concubines have drunk wine from them, and you have praised the gods of silver and of gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see or hear or know. But the God in whose hand is your breath, and whose are all your ways, you have not honored." Then from his presence the hand was sent, and this writing was inscribed. And this is the writing that was inscribed: Mene, Mene, Tekel, and Parsin. This is the interpretation of the matter. Meaning, God has numbered the days of your kingdom and brought it to an end. Tekel, you have been weighed in the balances, found wanting. Paris, your kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. It's quite a speech to give to a man who allegedly holds your life in the palm of his hand. And it struck me just for the first time as I was studying through this earlier this week, what Daniel's reaction must have been to walk into that banqueting hall and to see the sacred vessels dirtied and made use of in a very profane festival of idolatry, bacchanal, and how angry he would have been. These words, they're actually a descending set of weights that were in use. It was the mina, the shekel, and the half shekel. It's a set of descending weights for a descending king. And the interpretation is very blunt. Now, if you remember, when Nebuchadnezzar had his dream, and Daniel gave the interpretation and its warning to him to say, if you change now, perhaps this won't befall you. It was a year before any of it happened. And this is why I said that we'll get back to the reward later. Because a reward from a king is only good as long as that king reigns. And it says, Belshazzar gave the command, and Daniel was clothed with purple. A chain of gold was put around his neck, and a proclamation was made about him that he should be third ruler in the kingdom. But that very night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. No wonder Daniel said, yeah, you could take your gifts and shove it. It's not going to be worth anything. In this case, not only was there, shall we say, no repentance? They were only afraid of this weird supernatural event. There was no fear of the God behind it. And it reminded me very much of that parable that Jesus told about the rich man who was thinking, oh, I have so much stuff. I should build more barns. And then I can have more stuff. And I can live a good life. And of course, God says to him in the middle of the night, you fool, this very night your life will be required of you. And what good will be then all the things you've laid up for yourself? None. This is the position we find Belshazzar the Chaldean king in. That very night, he's killed. His kingdom is overturned. And whatever, it's like, that has got to be probably the shortest proclamation ever. Third highest in a kingdom that ends in, what, maybe 4 hours, 5 hours? But the funny thing is that this new king that comes along, when he's establishing his administration, sets Daniel above the whole kingdom. Not third, but just below himself. So it is as if the reward for faithfulness is valid no matter who has the apparent power. Because what we've learned through these two incidents is that we know who has the real power, who has authority over all the kings of the earth, over all the powers of heaven, of earth, of hell. He will do as he chooses. And as Nebuchadnezzar says, none can stay his hand or say to him, what have you done? Not the kind of experience that you expect an exile to have. We think exile, and we automatically think at the mercy of whatever power has dragged you away from your home and put you in this foreign place. But the experience of Daniel, again and again and again, is that wherever he is, in whatever context, under whatever king, God is still sovereign. So next week we are going back to Ezekiel. And to be honest, I'm not altogether sure what we're going to do with him yet, because there's a lot going on, and there is quite a lot to say about him. So we're done for today. Have an excellent week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Happy Mother's Day.
Thanks, Heather.
Happy Mother's Day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.